It doesn't matter how smart you are. If you're starting with earth, air, fire, and water, you're just not going to understand chemistry. You can't build chemistry on earth, air, fire, and water. It doesn't matter how smart you are. And that's the problem we've got. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If you start with physical systems in space and time, you cannot boot up a theory of consciousness. It's just not possible.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart and the ears, if you're watching on YouTube, of Pins the Podcat. Here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast. Oh, here she is, number 130. And this episode is with Donald Hoffman. Hold on, I gotta cover this window that has my face on it. With Donald Hoffman, who is professor in the Department of Cognitive Sciences at the University of California, Irvine, where he also has joint appointments in the Department of Philosophy, the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science, and the School of Computer Science. And if that didn't tell you all you needed to know about what I'm about to say already, like many of my guests, it seems, Don has contributed to research in a great many areas, from the very practical, vehicle lighting and blue jean design to accentuate the buttocks, which we get into, and canonical philosophical issues like the mind-body problem and standard cognitive science like shape perception. In this episode, we talk about two of those things. We talk a bit about the mind-body problem and a lot about butts that look good in blue jeans. But in this episode, we mainly talk about Don's recent best-selling book, which is The Case Against Reality. And the book offers a very novel approach to the pretty old thesis, I think, that we don't directly perceive reality with our senses, and that what we do see, hear, taste, and smell and touch, I guess, is not, so to speak, the truth of what's out there. So Don and I begin by talking about how he thinks of consciousness and its relation to neuroscience, which is really important for setting up his views on perception, since pretty naturally we have to understand the perceiver to know what perception is. But we then move on to the crux of his argument, which is that evolution by natural selection does not select for faculties that perceive truth, but faculties that perceive whatever will result in greater fitness. And Don will, or does, in fact, elaborate at length on my gloss on this in our conversation. But a good metaphor that we actually start out with, but that I'll share a bit of now, that a good metaphor that he employs, it likens our perception of objects in the world to our perception of icons on our computer screen. So they're quite useful for getting things done, but they don't actually bear any resemblance to objective reality on the one hand, or by the metaphor, what's happening inside of your computer on the other. So there is a link to The Case Against Reality, of course, in the description. Another thing I should mention is that there is a little bit of scratching on Don's microphone in the first 5 or 10 minutes of our conversation, but it's quite bearable. It's pretty minor, and we figured that out in the first, like I said, 5 or 10 minutes. Then likes, comments, reviews, subscribes. My favorite thing are reviews and subscribes. Those are all very, very, very helpful. Please do so if you haven't. And then without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Don. Before we get into The Case Against Reality, I'm wondering what direction the book came from. And what I mean is whether you were compelled to think about these issues because your research suggested that our experience is not of some objective reality, or maybe because, like Neo in The Matrix, which you reference often, or who you reference often, you had the sneaking suspicion that reality was very different from what you encountered in waking life. And I should note right now that as I read, there were many moments when I felt queasy, which is, I think, a sure mark that I was seriously questioning whether I'm utterly uncoupled from reality.
Well, yeah, I didn't start off thinking we don't see the truth. Far from it. I, in fact, started off thinking about this stuff about perception when I was at MIT as a graduate student. And we were working, I was working with David Marr, who was my advisor in the artificial intelligence lab there and was now the brain and cognitive science department. So we were combining computational methods to study perception with neuroscience methods and also standard psychophysical methods, trying to just understand how perception works. And so I studied visual perception, and it occurred to me that as I looked at the various kinds of mathematical models we were getting, that there was something in common with all these mathematical models had a common theme, even though the particular perceptual topic was different. It might be visual perception of color versus shape or auditory perception, whatever. It seemed like there was some kind of mathematical core that was the same. So I decided to try to pursue that. And it was pursuing that after I left MIT and came to UC Irvine, was working with Bruce Bennett and Chetan Prakash, trying to really nail down a general mathematical model of perception. And once we had, we worked on it for a couple years. And once we had something like a good formal model, as I started to study it with Bruce and Chetan, I began to realize that it had this implication that potentially we're not seeing the truth. And that disturbed me. When I recognized that the mathematics might be indicating that, it disturbed me. And then later on, as I thought about, evolutionary psychology and evolution itself, there's evolution shapes us, as many brilliant evolutionary theorists like Steven Pinker, his paper, So How Does the Mind Work? He points out that there are all sorts of selection pressures for us not to have true beliefs. We do things on the cheap. We do things quickly. We do things to impress people. There's lots of things that go on. And so I was sort of pushed, kicking and screaming against my will, to this idea that, we don't see reality as it is. But the more I pursued it, the more it seemed to stack up. And then the more I started to pursue understanding consciousness too, the more I began to think that it all stacked up. So I didn't go in just trying to prove what I already believed. I came into this kicking and screaming like most people. And frankly, my emotions still rebel to this day.
You mentioned David Marr, and I'd really like to get back to him when we discuss veridical perception, because I know that he was your doctoral advisor for at least a portion of your time working toward your PhD. But before we delve into consciousness, which is where I think things start, just to whet the appetite for an understanding of experience as misleading about the nature of reality, or misleading about whether we perceive the truth, as you just put it, I think a great place to start is with your metaphor of a computer desktop or even the home screen on an iPhone. So how can we use this picture to get a handle on what it means to suggest that we don't perceive whatever's objectively out there?
Yeah, most of us feel intuitively that when we look around and we see the moon, and then we see a tree, and then we see a rock, and then we see a car, that we're seeing pretty much reality as it is. Not in every detail, but the moon is there, even if I don't look, and so is that rock. And the rock was probably there for thousands of years, and the moon for who knows how many billions of years. And so their existence doesn't depend on me, and I'm seeing them pretty much as they are. Of course, I'm not seeing all the microscopic details of the molecular states and so forth, but we understand that. At the top level, I'm seeing their surface pretty much accurately. And so that's the standard view. So it's almost, because that metaphor is more like a window. Our perceptions are a window on reality. Of course, it's not completely clear window, and I'm not seeing the microscopic structures and so forth, but I'm seeing, as far as I'm seeing, it's true in general. It's true. But there's another metaphor that I think is more apt given evolutionary considerations, and that is that we've been shaped by evolution to have sensory sense systems that guide adaptive behavior, period. That's what they do. On evolutionary grounds, your perceptions of color, motion, shape, sounds, and so forth are there for one purpose, that's to guide adaptive behavior. The assumption that they also show the truth is an extra assumption that goes beyond what evolutionary theory would suggest. What evolutionary theory suggests is a different metaphor, that our senses evolved like a desktop interface. So there's a reality out there that's unbelievably complicated. Our goal is to stay alive, interact with that reality and stay alive long enough to reproduce. We don't need to know what that reality is. All we need to know is how to interact with it to survive long enough to reproduce. So just like with your computer, you don't need to know about the diodes and resistors and voltages and magnetic fields inside that computer to edit your photos or send a text. In fact, you don't want to know all that detail about the innards of the computer. What you want is something that gives you an adaptive guide to using the computer, right? So that's what the interface is for. Your desktop interface or your interface on your phone or whatever is there to hide the truth, all the complexity of the diodes and resistors and voltages and magnetic fields, to hide all that reality and just give you eye candy, the eye candy you need to get done what you need to get done. And that's my conclusion based on just mathematical modeling of perception and then evolutionary considerations. And then later on we can talk about, I think physics ultimately agrees, that our perceptions of space and time and objects in space and time, as complicated as it seems, as rich and powerful and real as it seems, is actually trivial compared to reality. Whatever reality is, space-time and the physical objects we see are trivial compared to the complexity of reality. And what we see is a user interface that dumbs things down and lets us do what we need to do to stay alive long enough to reproduce.
In this metaphor, the desktop icons don't even count, I think it's fair to say, as a distorted window of what's going on in the computer, in the sense that you mentioned that the standard view of perception is that our perceptions are a window on reality. And I say this because these icons, so I mean like the mail icon on my computer doesn't look at all like the transistors, the files, whatever's going on within the computer. Is the analogy to our perception of the world the same in this sense, that what we see is really this disconnected or this disparate from the underlying reality, or is the connection closer on your view?
On my view, it's at least as different as the desktop metaphor, at least as different. My view is that space-time itself, and therefore all of the objects inside space-time, is a trivial data structure compared to reality. So all of what appears to us is the complexity and detail of objects and their colors and molecular, structures and so forth, all of that is unbelievably trivial compared to the nature of objective reality. And so the desktop metaphor, I think, doesn't go far enough to reveal the triviality of our perceptions compared to the reality.
Well, because this is ultimately going to be a theory about how you and I and other humans connect with the world, so much of the work here, which will eventually culminate in your theory of conscious realism, which we'll get to, hinges on an understanding of consciousness. But I mean, with some exceptions, the consensus is that we have no real significant understanding at this point of just what produces consciousness, so the neural basis of consciousness. And I saw that, in the book, The Case Against Reality, you mention a discussion that you and Francis Crick had about how we ought to carry on in the absence of a theory. And what's the suggestion here? What's the connection? I guess I saw this as well. You see between the vitalism debate, the discovery of DNA, and then the neural basis of consciousness.
Right. So I'm very interested in consciousness and its relationship to brain activity, as are many of my colleagues. Francis Crick, when he was alive, Christoph Koch, and many of my friends and colleagues who are studying consciousness. We're all very interested in how my experience of the taste of chocolate and the smell of garlic and the color red are related to activity in visual cortex and frontal lobe cortex and so forth of the brain. There's clearly correlations. There's no doubt anybody who's serious in this field understands that there are serious neural correlates for conscious experiences. They're complicated, they're not simple, but there are neural correlations, and there are also correlations between certain kinds of strokes and certain losses of certain kinds of perceptual abilities. For example, if you have a stroke in area V4 in the left hemisphere, you can lose all color perception in the right visual field. So you have hemiachromatopsia. Now, that's a major change in your perceptual experience, your conscious experiences. So there's no doubt that there are neural correlates of consciousness, conscious experiences. There's no doubts that damaging the brain can fundamentally alter your perceptual experiences. The question, so those are clear data. The question is to have a scientific theory that explains this. And most of my colleagues, and that included Francis when he was alive, working on this problem, most of them assume that there's a causal relationship, that neural activity somehow is responsible for causing our conscious experiences. And of course, Francis freely admitted that he didn't know how that happened. He was coming up, he and Christoph and others were working on theories to try to explain that, but he freely admitted he didn't know, and his theories are just theories. But the idea was, just like with life and vitalism, we didn't understand what life was. How could just physical systems become alive? Was there some elan vital that made that happen, or what was the trick for life? And when Francis Crick, with the discovery of DNA, the double helix and so forth, with Watson, that all of a sudden unlocked a very big, keen insight into replication and other properties of life that made them far less mysterious. It began to demystify life, and it made vitalism seem much more implausible. Certainly not necessary to explain life. We could actually now just talk about DNA and the encoding of information inside the DNA. And Francis was hoping to do the same thing for consciousness that he'd done for life, to demystify it by finding, in this case, the neural basis. Instead of a double helix basis, there'd be a neural basis for consciousness. And I'm really grateful to Francis because I was starting to work on consciousness in the 1980s, but it wasn't kosher. You couldn't talk about it. So I wrote a book with Bruce and Chetan called Observer Mechanics. What I really wanted was basically mechanics of consciousness, but we couldn't call it that. We'd be dismissed. So, but after Francis said it was okay to talk about consciousness, then you could talk about consciousness. So hats off to Francis for really making consciousness on the table as a scientific discipline, and really helped to launch it. I mean, of course, there were people working on it before, but you had to sort of do it with a bit of disreputable stuff going on because it was consciousness. And so that was what Francis said. We just needed to continue to look at the neuroscience until we found that key empirical bit of data that broke the whole thing open. So that's what he was doing. And but my take is there are many theories of consciousness right now that start with physical systems like brains and neurons. So there's integrated information theory, which is not restricted to brains and neurons. It's more functional in general, but they are always looking at brains and neurons for their applications. There's orchestrated collapse of neuronal molecular tubule quantum states, Penrose and Hameroff. There's there's global workspace theory. There are many theories of consciousness that basically are looking for some aspect of neural activity or neural architectures that will explain the emergence of consciousness. So the fundamental idea is you start with unconscious ingredients, space-time and physical objects that are unconscious, electrons, protons, all the particles of the standard model. These are all unconscious, but when you get them complicated enough and it's in complicated enough systems, then somehow their functional properties give rise to consciousness. And that's, I would say, 99% of my colleagues in this field. That's the approach that they're taking. First, an important piece of data. There is no single theory on offer by anybody today. Integrated information theory, global neuronal workspace theory, orchestrated collapse of microtubule, quantum states, that can explain any specific conscious experience. And by that I mean, what is the specific pattern of integrated information that must be the taste of chocolate and could not be the smell of garlic? And I asked Tononi that question back in the 1990s, that when he came to UC Irvine and gave a talk to us. I asked him that question back then, and I asked him a couple years ago. And the answer is, there's not any specific conscious experience right now that his theory can explain, and no theory. So I asked Stuart Hameroff in front of an audience a few years ago, give me one. So Stuart, orchestrated collapse in neuronal microtubule quantum states. So what is the orchestrated collapse that must be the taste of whatever, the mint or whatever? Can you give me one? And I had to push on him 3 or 4 times before he finally said he couldn't give me one. And that's the state of play. And this is not, in science, we're used to having a few successes. Here, there are no specific conscious experiences, period, anywhere that can be explained by any of these physicalist theories, none. The best they can do is to say we have these correlations between these sort of patterns of activity and being conscious or not. And we can go into later on what I think about those. But that's different than saying, I can explain how this conscious experience emerges. This particular there are no particular conscious experiences that can be explained. And so I think my take is that the failure is principled. These, by the way, these are my friends and colleagues. They're geniuses, many of them. They're brilliant. So they're not failing because they're dumb. They're failing because, unfortunately, their assumptions preclude any solution. You can't start with unconscious ingredients and boot up consciousness. And as soon as they recognize that, I think, and they start thinking about mathematical models of consciousness, qua consciousness, this field is going to explode because these guys are geniuses, guys in the general. So these people are geniuses, right? They're brilliant. And as soon as they, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If you're starting with earth, air, fire, and water, you're just not going to understand chemistry. You can't build chemistry on earth, air, fire, and water. Doesn't matter how smart you are. And that's the problem we've got. Doesn't matter how smart you are. If you start with physical systems in space and time, you cannot boot up a theory of consciousness. It's just not possible. But I came to that conclusion kicking and screaming. I was a physicalist, and so was my own mathematical models, and then understanding what evolutionary theory entails. And then really understanding what I think high energy theoretical particle physicists now understand about space-time. That all of that together has convinced me, despite my emotions, even though my emotions completely rebel, intellectually, I'm completely convinced that consciousness cannot be derived from anything inside space-time.
So just to zoom out a bit, the idea that comes from Frick then is that continuing to search for NCCs in the same way that DNA revealed the mechanism for life's propagation and sophistication, and then despite its lack, again, the search for NCCs of success in the most crucial dimension, it may eventually lead to an understanding of the source of consciousness. So that comes from Frick, but your thought is that we won't be able to do this because the whole framework is ill-founded on objects in space-time.
Right. So I'll be very, very clear about so I think that Francis is right. We should study the neural correlates of consciousness. Absolutely. And we should study neuroscience. In fact, I think neuroscience needs more funding, not less, because neuroscience is a lot harder than we thought. It's a much, much harder discipline than we thought when we look inside, through microscopes inside brains and we see neurons and synapses and so forth, that's what we're dealing with. No, that's a thin interface veneer of the reality we're dealing with. The reality is much, much more complicated. So we have to take what we see in terms of neural networks in the brain and reverse engineer it and ask, what is the much deeper and more complex reality behind that? That's how we're going to get our understanding of consciousness. So I agree with Francis, and Francis, he was a truly stunning genius. I had the privilege of knowing him in his late 70s and 80s. and he was quicker, sharper, had a better memory than I had in my 20s when he was in his, it was just truly stunning. Some people, not only did he, discover the genes, he had the genes. He had the right genes. So he was brilliant. But it's still the case that, of course, we need to study the neural correlates of consciousness. He's absolutely right about that. But the idea that once we understand those neural correlates, we'll understand how brain activity causes conscious experience. No, not at all. We're understanding an interface level correlation, but that correlation does not mean that there's a brain causation. Even the fact, someone might say, well, look, Don, you just said a minute ago that if you lesion area V4 in the left hemisphere, you will lose color experience in the right visual field. What better evidence of causation could you possibly have? And the answer is that that's no evidence of causation at all. There is clean correlation, but there's not causation. If I drag my file icon, if I'm writing a book and I drag my file icon to the trash can, I will lose my book, right? Serious damage has been done. Does that mean that the actual motion of the icon on my desktop to the trash can, that motion of the icon caused my book to be deleted? No, it didn't. That icon didn't cause anything. It's correlated, absolutely. There's a strong correlation between moving icons to the trash can and things disappearing. Strong correlation. Just like if you damage B4, color disappears. So strong correlation, absolutely, but causation, absolutely not.
With regard to Frick's genius and quickness in his 70s and 80s, I spoke to Chomsky on the podcast when he was 94, maybe he's 95 now, but it was just amazing to me how blisteringly quick he is. I mean, so much quicker than me. I can only imagine what he must have been like in his 20s, 30s, and 40s. It was pretty crazy just trying to keep up with him.
I took a class from Chomsky when I was at MIT in like 1982. So that was 41 years ago. So he was in his 50s, I guess, at the time. He was so smart. I had no idea how smart he was. That class, by the way, in that class was Jerry Fodor, who was a very brilliant psycholinguist and philosopher, and also Thomas Kuhn, the one of the most famous philosophers of science of the 20th century.
The three of them co-taught it?
So it was team taught by Chomsky and Fodor, but Thomas Kuhn was in the class, and there were maybe 80 of us graduate students in there, and it was one of the highlights of my life to be there. And Chomsky was clearly the intellectual king in the room.
Well, that sounds like a legendary course to be in.
It was electrifying. It was really. I will never forget Chomsky. Fodor told us one day, Chomsky on the next class is going to tell us his solution to the mind-body problem. I was, oh boy! So I was there, paper in pencil in hand, right front row, up ready to go. And Chomsky told us, he said, my solution to the mind-body problem is that there is no mind-body problem, because we don't have an adequate notion of body. Physics is an open and evolving field, and physicists will take whatever new esoteric concept they need to explain what's going on. So unless we have a finally completed physics, we can't talk about what we mean by the mind-body problem.
It's funny that you mentioned this anecdote about the mind-body problem, because when I spoke with him, he said that the biggest problem or the biggest mistake philosophers ever made was treating everything above the neck differently from everything below it. And it's funny because a lot of people that I've spoken with about Chomsky, particularly linguists, often say or criticize him that he's been saying the same thing for 50 years, 40 years, 30 years.
Well, if you're right, you're right. It's a whole wide thing you can. But I'm not saying Chomsky is always right, of course. No one's always right. But I will say this: I don't know if I've ever seen anybody more brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Well, Returning to our line of thought, you mentioned one of the very interesting NCCs and its roles with it was the strokes in V4 and the loss of color vision. I was hoping to ask you about a similar issue that hasn't come up on the podcast at all, but it's very curious, and that's of the corpus callosotomy. So the severing of the corpus callosum, which is the bridge between the brain's two hemispheres. What do the results of these procedures suggest about the basis of consciousness or its nature?
Yeah, it's really quite intriguing. So your brain has two hemispheres, a left and a right hemisphere. And the two are connected by a cable that we call the corpus callosum. The cable has roughly 200 million 225 million axons. A little bit bigger in women than men. Their brains, their hemispheres are slightly better connected than men's in general. And there were surgeries done a few decades ago for patients who had intractable epilepsy that couldn't be treated with drugs. And in cases where it was life-threatening and the quality of life was terrible, they resorted to some serious surgeries. I actually knew one of the surgeons who did this, Joe Bogan, a friend of mine. And what Joe and other surgeons involved in this would do is they would, take off the skull cap a little bit and take a scalpel and cut this band of fibers between the left and right hemisphere and the corpus callosum. Sometimes it would be the entire corpus callosum, but sometimes they'd only cut a part if they could get away with it, trying to do the minimal amount of damage they could to. The idea was that if you, say, had an epileptic focus, a bad area of the brain, say in the left hemisphere, that was causing the epileptic seizure, if you cut the corpus callosum, you could prevent the haywire electrical activity of the left hemisphere from spreading to the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere could stay conscious and alert and help the person, get through. But if the right hemisphere goes under, then you just collapse, you have, convulsions, whatever it might be. It could be life-threatening. So the surgery, you can see it was a radical surgery. It was desperate, but it worked. It was a clinical success. It actually reduced the frequency and severity of the epileptic seizures. So it was a clinical success. But Roger Sperry and others who studied these patients discovered that they had some very interesting dissociations of their consciousness. So I won't go into all the details, but what I will say is that the left hemisphere has a different consciousness than the right hemisphere, and even a different personality. So my friend V.S. Ramachandran, who studied some of these, he talks about one patient in which the left hemisphere believed I think the left hemisphere believes in God and the right hemisphere is an atheist. Right? They have different religious beliefs. The left hemisphere wanted to have a desk job, and the right hemisphere wanted to be a race car driver. And so you can actually the two hemispheres are so separate in their knowledge that they can play 20 questions. So you can say, give the right hemisphere a word, or ask the right hemisphere to come up with a word, and then the left hemisphere has to guess what the word is, and all the right hemisphere only say yes or no by maybe the right hemisphere controls the left hand, so maybe you can say put thumb up for yes, thumb down for no. So the right hemisphere is thumb up or thumb down. The left hemisphere is guessing, and the left hemisphere after 20 guesses sometimes doesn't get it. So they talk about consciousness being severed. You can debate whether it's being severed or not, but when you can play 20 questions with yourself and lose, that suggests that there's a dissociation of consciousness that's pretty severe. And when you do classic experiments, like when you flash up on the screen very quickly, two words like the phrase key ring. So key, you're looking straight ahead, and key is to the left of where you're looking, and ring is to the right of where you're looking. The right hemisphere will give evidence that it saw the word key, and the left hemisphere will give evidence that it saw the word ring, and no one gives evidence of having seen the phrase key ring. So there's all sorts of clean evidence, again, that an action on the brain, cutting the corpus callosum, has profound consequences correlated with it on consciousness. So once again, And most of my colleagues would say, clearly that shows that the neural activity must be causing the conscious experiences. But again, that's way too quick. The data are clear that cutting of the corpus callosum is correlated with profound changes in conscious experiences, but that does not entail that the brain activity itself is causing the conscious experiences. Then that's that quick move that we all just think is so natural is the thing that's the impediment to making real progress here.
Since I know that you're very well versed in philosophy and philosophers' work on perception and consciousness, I wonder how sympathetic you are to Dan Dennett's idea that consciousness isn't just one thing, but a number of faculties that combine. And I think that this notion is supported by the evidence from corpus callosotomy, since it shatters the illusion of a unitary consciousness. We can imagine toggling these NCCs, like the color representing capacity of the V4 region, on and off one by one until there's nothing left.
So I know Dan, and he's brilliant. Our theories of consciousness are quite different. He's a physicalist, and actually in some cases he seems to be an illusionist about consciousness. That what we think of as conscious experiences are an illusion, but nevertheless, granting that, he says what you said, with that there are multiple drafts going on, and I do think that myself. So my own view is that it's very profitable to think of consciousness as not just one thing, but as multiple different kinds of consciousness. And when we look at this cut of the corpus callosum, and we see two different personalities, one that has, that believes in God, and one that doesn't. That's pretty profound. Different changes, different goals in life for their jobs, but those are profound differences in consciousness. So I think it's very useful for us as scientists to think about consciousness as being divisible, profitably using mathematical models in which we view consciousness as being divisible. And the mathematical model that my conscious agent model does just that. It's talking about what we call separate conscious agents. It's also true that mathematics entails that ultimately there's just one consciousness. And these are all the separate consciousnesses are in some sense projections of one consciousness mathematically. And that's just a theorem that follows from our mathematical model. So I started off, I didn't feel smart enough to get a mathematical model of one ultimate consciousness, but I thought I could start off with little mathematical models of smaller consciousnesses and work my way up. And that mathematical model did say that when you have more than one conscious agent, even if they're not interacting, just what we call their tensor product satisfies the definition of being a conscious agent. So it's another conscious agent. And so that leads you very quickly to the conclusion that there's one conscious agent, right? Take as many, say I have a countable infinity of conscious agents. Any subset of them is a conscious agent. So I can take the power set of this countable set. I'll have a new infinity, Aleph 1 instead of Aleph 0, and Aleph 1, bigger infinity of new conscious agents. I take the power set of that, I get Aleph 2, Aleph 3. So I go all the way up Cantor's hierarchy in terms of conscious agents, and that's pointing me that there is ultimately only one conscious agent, but I'll never get there because there's no end to Cantor's hierarchy. So it's a long technical response to your question, but I think it's absolutely necessary because I think ultimately there is one conscious agent, but I see no way mathematically to ever treat it because I can't get to the end of Cantor's hierarchy. So all I can do is look at individual projections as separate entities, separate conscious entities, and deal with that. That's all I can actually deal with. But somehow this combination has to be taken seriously. And I'm thinking quite a bit about that. Somehow these separate projections, when you look at their interactions, it really is, take seriously the idea that there really is a new entity, a new consciousness, a useful unit of consciousness that's nevertheless just a projection of this deeper infinite. So I'm talking informally. Ultimately, what we have to do, and we can't do it, of course, on the podcast, is look at the mathematics and say, here's what. Sure, I understand. That's Siri giving her a bit. So have all we can do as scientists is we can take the kind of informal discussions we're having right now and say, okay, let's make it mathematically precise and see what it means to talk about these individual consciousnesses. And the best I can say right now is that what it means is there is this one consciousness, but there are useful projections to smaller consciousnesses, and it's useful analytically and theoretically to talk about them and to talk about their combination, in part because we can never analytically describe the one. So we have to do what we can do.
Well, I will save delving more deeply into conscious realism for later, but before we move on to perception, truth, and fitness, you and Dennett, as you said at the beginning, you have different views about consciousness, and earlier you referenced some of the other theories like global workspace. Now, at bottom, you're a scientist, like you just said a minute ago. And I think you hinted at this earlier, but what would be the hallmarks of a scientific theory of consciousness? What are its desiderata? How would we know if we had one? What's the end goal that everybody is searching for?
I'll answer it by first saying as a physicalist, if I were a physicalist, my desiderata would be. I would say that I had succeeded with a physicalist theory if I could say, for example, in the case of integrated information, this specific Q shape, this specific pattern of integrated information, for theoretical reasons, must be the taste of mint. And here's exactly why it must be the taste of mint and why it could not be anything else. But not just one. I would want to have accounts for thousands and thousands of conscious experiences, right? I want to account, right? If I have a theory of electrodynamics and I say, well, okay, I can account for this electron interaction, and I can account for why I get this kind of light from a photodiode, and I can account for all these very specific things, and I can do it and I can predict the magnetic moment of the electron to 8 decimal places or whatever it is now. So, I mean, if I can do that kind of stuff, then I'm not saying my theory is right, but that would be a sine qua non for me being happy with my theory. This is a theory that's worth overthrowing now. This is not a theory that should be ignored. This is a theory that's worth being overthrown. But if a theory cannot explain even one specific conscious experience, then now that's for any physicalist theory. As soon as they can start to explain specific conscious experiences, not just is something maybe conscious or not, that's way too easy. Specific conscious experiences, then I'm interested. Now for someone like me that's the scientist and saying, okay, I'm not trying to do that. I'm not starting with physical stuff and trying to boot up consciousness. So what do I have to do? So I have to do a couple things before I have a theory that I'm happy with. I have to first have a mathematical theory of consciousness where the math is completely clear. But second, I need to then be able to explain something that I can measure in space-time, right? I need to be able to, so if I'm saying, so I'm going to propose that consciousness is not something that emerges from physical objects inside space-time. That's the standard story, is that the universe began 13.8 billion years ago, although recent data suggests maybe double that now. Maybe it's 27 billion years ago. We'll see. The Big Bang was a long time ago. But the idea is that there were no conscious entities to begin with. There was just the precursors of the particles of the standard model of physics right now, the bosons, leptons, and quarks. But nothing conscious. And then consciousness emerged later on. So I'm starting with a completely different framework than that says the consciousness emerges from physical stuff. I'm saying there's consciousness prior to space-time period. And so for that kind of model, I need to be able to say what the dynamics is, and I need to be able to say what in space-time, like that we think of as particles, like electrons that have mass and position, momentum, and spin. I want to get those properties, specific properties, from my theory of conscious agents. So for me, success to begin with, just a first baby step success would be a theory of conscious agents that it gives you clean predictions for what's happening inside a proton, the quarks and gluons inside, that predicts the distribution of momenta at all the Q square and the very basically the temporal and spatial resolutions that the physicists have probed so far. If I can start with a theory of consciousness outside space-time and actually give you the innards of the proton precisely, and there's many decades of data on this. So if I can first tell you, this is what this property of a dynamics of conscious agents corresponds to the mass, this corresponds to momentum, this corresponds to energy, here's spin, and here is distance. This is what corresponds to distance. I need to do that first. So I need to show, so instead of showing how consciousness emerges from physical particles, I have to show how a theory of consciousness gives rise to all the properties of physical properties, including their spatial distributions. Not because I think that's the most interesting thing to do with a theory of consciousness, it's not, but it's what I have to do to show that I'm onto something that's worthwhile. And that would just be the baby start. Once I've got the innards of the proton, I need to crawl my way up. So now how about the nucleus of an atom? And then the atom itself, and then molecules, and then macromolecules, and then climb all the way up to neuroscience. You might say, well, Hoffman, why don't you go straight to neuroscience? Because there we have the nice, clean neural correlates of and the answer is the same reason why I do addition before I try to do calculus. I mean, you got to start simple and work your way up. Yeah, the neural correlates are our ultimate target, but that's way too complicated. I need to go down. My baby step is going to be protons and the inner structure, because that's the simplest thing we know. That's the simplest we can do, and that's where we also have very, very hard data. So that's what. So I in some sense, of course, I'm interested in protons, but I'm not more interested in protons than the brain. But the reason I'm going after protons is because just science. I mean, it's just that's where you have the best shot of making a connection, and also where there's so much data that if you don't have it, the data is going to say, no, you don't have it right. If your mass is off in the third decimal place, your mass is off in the third decimal place. You don't have that kind of accuracy in neuroscience yet. So that's where I'm going after. So that's my long answer to your short question. For the physicalist, they need to start with physical systems and explain specific conscious experiences, or frankly, I'm not terribly interested. There's nothing on the table. And for me, to get my colleagues interested, I have to explain exactly the momentum distribution of quarks and gluons inside the proton. I've got to get it right to several decimal places. And that doesn't mean I'm right, but at least it means if I'm wrong, it's still interesting. It's interesting to figure out where it's wrong. And of course, any theory is wrong in the sense that it's at best a limited version of something deeper.
Well, your long answer to my short question is great. A theory of consciousness that predicts what's going on in a proton is so far from the mainstream physicalist idea, which is very cool, very ambitious, and I'm glad we're talking about it. And I also like that you brought up mint at the beginning of your response, just because I know how important it is with regard to your case study of a synesthetic that you write about. And hopefully we'll come back to that later. But now I think we're ready to move over or toward the case against reality itself. So where I thought we ought to begin is this. What is it that makes the concept of, or maybe more accurately, our perception of beauty so special to the extent that it's your first piece of evidence in the line of argument charging that our perception is very, very misleading?
Oh, right. So in my book, I talk about our perception of beauty partly because I think it's a good introduction to evolutionary ideas. What is it that we find attractive? And most people are interested in that topic anyway. So I talked about it in my book because, it's It's a fun topic. We all have a natural interest in it, and there are surprising results from evolutionary theory, and one of the things that comes out of the evolutionary theory is that first, our feeling of sexual attractiveness is really, from an evolutionary point of view, a sophisticated inference, where we use lots of sensory information. You meet a person, and within just a few hundred milliseconds, your senses are picking up all sorts of visual, auditory, and smell information, and you're doing one of the most sophisticated computations you do in your entire life. You're estimating the reproductive fitness of the person in front of you. How likely is it that this person could have and raise successfully children? So you're not consciously thinking. You're just thinking this person looks great, or you're thinking they don't look great. Whatever it might be. Have a scale from hot to not, and then that's just your knee-jerk reaction. But what's going on behind that emotional reaction is a very sophisticated computation where you're literally evaluating scores and scores of cues, and the cues themselves are not always consistent. So they give contradictory information, and so you're adjudicating among all these cues and coming up with a bottom line. What is the reproductive potential of this person? How likely are they to successfully have and raise kids, to be a good father or mother, basically? And so, and that the output of that sophisticated computation is a feeling that you could, on a scale from 0 to 10, for example, that's a feeling that you get. And it's not just humans that have this, but all sorts of other species are evaluating potential mates. And there's the very humorous one of the jewel beetle.
The stubbies.
That's right. So the jewel beetle is this beetle. There are many of them in Australia and the outback, and they're dippled, glossy, and brown. And the males fly, and the females are flightless. But the males fly around looking for females, and when he finds one that looks good, he alights and mates. And the funny thing is that a lot of Australian guys drinking these beers in the bottles that he calls stubbies. They're short brown bottles that are dimpled, glossy, and just the right shade of brown to tickle the fancy of these beetles. The guys, these Australian guys throwing their beer bottles out in the outback, and the jewel beetle males were flocking all over these bottles. They're just crawling all over them because those bottles chicked off everything that the male was looking for. Here, this is a female. She's dimpled, glossy, and brown, and she's huge. And even when the beetles are crawling on the bottle, they have full body contact with the bottle. They cannot. They still are. They're swooning over this bottle. They're trying to mate with this bottle. So what we think of as beauty and attractiveness. Clearly, you start to see that. So evolution, from an evolutionary point of view, that is what I just described. It's an estimate of the reproductive potential of the person or the entity in front of you. The jewel beetle is doing it as well. He's making an estimate of the reproductive potential of this, and in his estimate, that bottle, that stubby, is really, really hot. So he's all over it, and the species would have gone extinct, actually, probably. They had to help those beetles save the species. And it was really quite strong. So what's going on here? Clearly, evolution didn't give the male jewel beetle a true insight into what a real female beetle was. It gave him a simple trick, a little hack. An eligible female is something dippled, glossy, and brown. The bigger, the better. That's apparently some little trick like that, and it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. You on the one hand, you need to do the computations to determine whether something is an eligible female, but you also need to make the computations as simple and inexpensive as possible, because computations require calories. And for every calorie that you waste or spend on, computations, you have to go out, kill something, and eat it to get those calories. And so there are selection pressures to do things on the cheap. And so that's going to be, and that's one of the points that Pinker makes in his book, How the Mind Works, and also his paper, So How Does the Mind Work? So Pinker points this kind of thing out. So I'm not saying anything new here. This is sort of, brilliant guys like Pinker have been saying this. So I'm just repeating what is standard in evolutionary theory. Where I go beyond is to say that, evolution itself is a physicalist theory, and we have to actually go beyond space-time. So that I love evolutionary theory, and within space-time, it's the right theory. It's the right theory of biological evolution. But if we're going to have a theory of consciousness outside of space-time, it better project into space-time and show us where evolution by natural selection comes out as a special case. That gets into another philosophy thing about the philosophy of science and the sequence of scientific theories that we have in science. That we may want to talk about that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, for the moment though, since you're totally right that we are all so interested in attractiveness, and probably, to be fair though, more human attractiveness than beetle attractiveness, and I also know that you're an expert on facial attractiveness. How does some of the research on iris sizes and limbal rings, which are a term that most of our listeners actually probably won't be familiar with, support this contention about perception's disconnect from truth?
That's right. So when you look at a person's face, you also get a hit of attractiveness or not of that face. And there are many, many cues that you use. Again, unconsciously, this is automatic. And among them are, there are many, many cues, but one that I talk about in my book, and one that I worked with a graduate student of mine, Darren Peshek, who did a lot of great work on this. What we worked on was the idea that if you look at a human person's eye closely, you can see the white of the eye, and then there's the dark iris. And if the iris is not too dark, you can sometimes see a little ring right where the white of the eye, the so-called sclera, meets the iris. There's a ring. For people with blue eyes or light brown, very light brown eyes, you can see this much more easily. You can see a ring, and as I was looking at that ring in various pictures, I realized that it looked to me like in babies, the ring looked more distinct and bigger, relatively speaking, than in adults. And that was really interesting to me because that suggested that the ring then could be a cue to age and also to health. If your eye gets old and gets cloudy, then you can't see the iris or that limbal ring very well. So having a clear and thick limbal ring would indicate a healthy eye and could also indicate, again, statistically, youth. So that was just the intuition I had. So I had a lot of my students, they got hundreds of pictures of photos of people of various ages and zoomed in on the eyes and measured the width of the limbal rings. And we got a statistical distribution that showed that, yes, as you age, the relative width of the limbal ring declines with age. And so we made the clean prediction that a clear and thick limbal ring would increase the attractiveness of a person. Also, I predicted that the youth aspect would be, it turns out that it's slightly more important in male ratings of female attractiveness to emphasize youth. Youth is also important in female ratings of male attractiveness, but not quite as strong as male ratings of female attractiveness. So we also, thought there could be some differences in male and female ratings. And so one of the experiments we did was we would take a picture of some face, some guy's face or some woman's face, and we would just make two pictures, the same picture twice in front of the person, but in one picture, we altered the limbal rings and made them a little bit thicker. That's all we did. Otherwise, the pictures were identical. And so the person, their instruction would be to sit down, you're going to look at a screen and you're going to see two faces, pick which one is the most attractive, just left button or right button for left or right face. And they start doing and then many times the subjects would be confused. They're the same face. you're asking me to judge and the faces are just exactly the same. We say, well, just humorous, just go with your gut, just pick one. And so consciously, they thought the faces were identical, but unconsciously, they well above chance picked the face that had the thicker limbal ring. They actually were getting the signal of attractiveness, even though they weren't consciously aware of it. So there are many, once you start going down this path, there are many, many different cues that you can study. So the white of the eye can be, the sclera is more slightly bluish in infants than in adults. It's a little bit thinner, and there's a choroid layer underneath it that's blue, and so you get a slight bluish tint to the white of the eye is a signal of youth, whereas a slight yellowish tint is a signal of older age and also of ill health, statistically. Again, these are all statistical things. This is not absolute. So another prediction is, if you take someone's eyes and you, especially for like a female's eyes, you make them just a little bit bluish on the whites of the eyes, that's going to be a signal of youth. You may not want to do that with male eyes, because you don't want, women aren't interested in kids. They don't want boys, they want men, right? So you have to be careful. What you do for a woman's face is not the same as what you're going to do for a man's face on the eyes. But when we do this, it again works. You get the ratings of attractiveness to come out as you expect, and all under the radar. No one. So you can actually use this. This is stuff you can use on your Facebook page or whatever. You can take if you want to look more attractive, there are things you can do. Just go to your eyes, go in there in Photoshop, again, be careful. If you're a guy, don't give yourself too blue an eye, because now you can start to look a little bit too boyish. But you can make it slightly, if you're a woman, you can make a slightly bluer sclera, make a slightly thicker limbal ring, and you will be more attractive. There are many, those are just two. There are many, many things you can do.
Well, I think the natural question to ask is, how can I make my limbal rings thicker and my sclera bluer? But I'm guessing that that's not possible. Well,
I was talking about in Photoshop, taking
right. Is it possible in actual?
Oh, in everyday life? Oh, well, you can make it less. You can make your sclera, the white of the eye, less yellow by living a healthy life. So eating well, and not
less
smoking. In other words, these are actually honest indicators of your fitness. So if you want your eyes to look fit, the way to do it is to be fit. To actually eat well, sleep well, take good care of yourself, and ultimately, the best thing you can do is be young. Right. That's the best thing you can do for yourself, is be young. And I'm 67, so I can't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll get back to the explicit connection, or disconnect might be more apt, between fitness and truth with the FBT theorem. But just like with physicalism and consciousness, I think it would behoove us to look at the main view opposite your own. And now this is where David Marr enters again. So he's come up on the podcast once before in connection just briefly with Marr's levels of explanation. But since, like I mentioned earlier, he was your advisor before his very early death, and his ideas about veridical perception are a foil to yours, maybe we could start by giving a charitable recounting of his position before moving on to your own.
Yeah, I wouldn't have to be charitable. I mean, David was my advisor. He was a genius. He's responsible for getting me into this field. I was reading his papers when I was an undergraduate at UCLA, taking a class. We read one of Marr's papers that electrified me. That's what got me to go to MIT and study visual perception. So I owe my life's direction to David Marr, and he was a brilliant advisor. But on this point, we disagree, and that's the nature of science. You liking your advisor doesn't mean that you're always going to agree with them. In fact, they want you to disagree if you can do it intelligently. So Marr argues in his book, and it's a great book. His book is called Vision. I highly recommend it. Published in like 1982, his book. And he argues in the case of less complicated organisms like flies, that their visual systems don't actually tell them the truth, that they just give them data that they need to fly as they need to fly. But he says when you get to more complicated organisms like humans, we actually estimate the true shapes and orientations of surfaces of objects in our environment. So he was very interested in what he called the 2.5D sketch, and also 3D models. 2.5D sketch was basically looking at your whole world around you and understanding all the surfaces that you could see and the shapes of those surfaces, the slant and tilt of the surface normals and so forth. And so he thought that we get more or less accurate estimates, and that evolution shaped us to have more or less accurate estimates because we were complicated enough. So his idea was, as you get more and more complicated organisms with more and more compute power, natural selection is going to more likely have them have true representations of what they need. Whereas if you're too simple, a fly just doesn't have enough neurons to get it right, so it just has to do little tricks and hacks. So that was sort of Marr's idea. And so I disagree with Marr. I agree with him on the fly. The fly just has tricks and hacks, but I say that the same is true of human beings, that our perceptions themselves are just a user interface, which ultimately is so simplified compared to the objective reality that it's essentially a trick and a hack as well. We think of space-time as the fundamental nature of reality, and physical objects as real entities inside that fundamental physical reality, and it's really just a headset and icons inside that headset. And it's in that sense that I call them tricks and hacks. It's more sophisticated than what the fly's doing, perhaps, but compared to the reality, it's still trivial.
Though this doesn't come from David Marr, I took a quote from your book that I think sums up the veridical perception view, though maybe you'd like to give your own gloss on it, and I have it over here. And it is from Zygmunt Piswo and his colleagues, who tell us, and now I'll quote them, that veridicality is an essential characteristic of perception and cognition. It is absolutely essential. Perception and cognition without veridicality would be like physics without the conservation laws.
Zygmunt Piswo, Zig, is a good friend of mine, and he's we debate this, but I actually voted to have him join my faculty in my department. So he's a member of my department here at UC Irvine. And I invited him to come, knowing full well that he completely disagrees with me. That's the way science works. You want to have smart people who disagree with you. And so Zig and I disagree. I think he thinks I'm off the rocker, with these ideas. He thinks that there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't believe that we've been shaped to see truly what's out there. And I think most of my colleagues would agree with him. I think that they think of course, we don't get everything exactly right, but the standard view in my field is something called Bayesian estimation. That basically what the visual system is doing is estimating the true shapes and colors and motions and whatever textures of physical objects. So we have data that we get at the retina, or if you're a computer vision person, you have some kind of video cameras, you're getting sensor data, and you have to take that data and then make the best Bayesian estimates you can about the true shapes, colors, motions, and textures. And so that's what Zig is up to. He's using that kind of Bayesian analysis to try to figure out, if we're going to make a self-driving car with camera systems, you have to take that video that's coming in. It's just video. It's just color. This pixel has this color, that pixel has that color, and that brightness. That's all you got. You have to take all that and say, and interpret it. Oh, there's a boy riding a bicycle, and I need to brake my car so I don't hit. So that requires an incredible amount of inference and incredible amount of computer processing. That's why self-driving cars are still not a thing. We thought that they would be a thing as of 2023. They're still not a safe thing yet. You are still responsible for driving your car. It can help you, but no one's letting go of the wheel completely yet. It'll eventually happen, but The fact that it hasn't happened yet shows how difficult this problem is. And so most of my colleagues, including my friend Zig, are saying that what we're doing is estimating the truth. And that's what my advisor Marr said as well, that we were estimating the truth. And that's what I believed. I mean, I went to study with Marr. I thought that was right. But I don't think it's right anymore.
Well, now that we have the veridicality account on the table, and I think it captures very well the folk intuition that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, that I think the way you put it, that our senses or our eyes are a window onto reality as it is. I think it's a good time now to move to the FBT theorem, or the fitness beats truth theorem. So why and how does it tell us that natural selection, which produced our brains and consequently these perceptual system we've been talking about, does not favor veridical perceptions? Maybe as evidenced by some of the examples we've been discussing, like the Australian beetles and the limbo rings.
Right. So it turns out that you can use evolution by natural selection as a mathematically precise theory. There's something called evolutionary game theory. So there's no hand waves now. This is a mathematical instantiation of Darwin's ideas, evolutionary game theory. And you can ask a clean technical question using that mathematics. The question is this: what is the probability that natural selection would shape any sensory system to see any true features of objective reality? Clean technical question. You can ask that of the math. And the answer that comes back is clear as well. It is precisely zero. The probability is precisely zero that any sensory system has ever been shaped to see any aspect of objective reality truthfully. Probability is precisely zero. That doesn't mean that it can't happen. It means that you would bet the farm that it's not going to happen. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It could happen, but the probability is zero that it will happen. And one way that you can see that is evolution. When you think about evolutionary game theory, there's something, when you play a game, like a video game, if you try to win in the game, you try to get points as fast as you can. You're trying to do whatever you do to get points. And if you get enough points, you go to the next level of the game, right? Well, in evolution, evolutionary game theory, there's something about what do you have to do? How do you get points in evolutionary theory? Well, ultimately, the ultimate payoff is that not that you go to the next generation, but your genes. You have kids. Your genes go to the next generation. Okay, but what corresponds to the payoffs? Well, or the points in the game is something called payoff functions in evolutionary theory. So when you have games, you have payoffs. If I have this strategy in a game, I'll get this payoff. If I do this strategy, I'll get this other payoff. So payoff functions then in evolutionary theory are functions that take an organism, its state, its action, and the state of the world, and they give you a payoff. If this organism is in this position in the world, and the organism is in this state, and it takes this action, it gets this many payoff points. Maybe payoffs go from 0 to 1,000, whatever you want it. And that's the way evolutionary game theory works. It is you have different strategies. So when an organism is in this situation, if it does this, the act of doing this, that's what we call a strategy. If you systematically do this kind of thing in this situation, that's a strategy. And the payoff function gives you what kind of reward points will you get for that strategy. So in evolutionary theory, you're just having various strategies compete with each other, and the strategies have different payoffs, and you then do the game theoretic analysis to see which strategy will dominate, will win over the other strategies. Well, so we looked at, there's several ways to prove this FBT theorem, but one way that I think is the cleanest is to just say, look at those payoff functions. They depend on the state of the world, so they're a mapping from the world, whatever the world is, into these payoff values, say 0 to 100. Now, if that payoff function is going to allow evolution to shape my sensory system to see some truth about the world, then the payoff function better preserve some information about that truth of the world. In other words, that if the payoff functions that are the only thing that's guiding my evolution, they're the thing that determines whether I live or die, whether my strategy lives or dies. If those payoff functions have no information about some feature of the world, then I can't be tuned by those payoff functions to the feature by the world, except by accident. But they will not tune me to it, right? I might accidentally go to it, but there will be no selection pressures to it. So mathematically, what I just said is this. What is the probability that a payoff function is a homomorphism of some structure in the world? So there's some structure in the world. What is the probability that the payoff function preserves it? Mathematically, that is, what does it mean? What is the probability that it's a homomorphism? So it turns into a clean mathematical question. You can take any structure you're interested in. So maybe a total order, like 1 is less than 2 is less than 3, that's a total order. Or a partial order, or a metric, things, distances, a metric structure, or a topology structure. There's all kinds of different structures that you can imagine might be true of the world. And you can say for each one of those structures that might be true of the world, what is the probability that a generically chosen payoff function is a homomorphism, contains information about that structure? That is a clean mathematical question. And so I took it to a brilliant mathematician friend of mine, Chetan Prakash, who I've worked with for 35 years. I worked on it a little bit, but he's the real mathematician. If it were just me, it wouldn't have been done. And the answer is, in case after case, every case that we've looked at so far, probability is 0. The probability, in other words, if you look at the set of all possible payoff functions, and you can write them down, say I have 100 possible payoff values, and I say the world has 20 billion states, I can write down how many payoff functions there are and just do the combinatorics. That's how many payoff functions there'd be. How many of those payoff functions would actually be homomorphism? There will be homomorphism. Absolutely. There will be functions that preserve that information. Absolutely. That's not the question. The question is, if we put the number of homomorphisms in the numerator and put the total number of payoff functions in the denominator, and then look at the ratio as the number of states in the world and the number of payoff values increases to infinity, what is the probability of a homomorphism? And it goes to 0. In every case, it goes to 0. In other words, the probability is 0 that a generically chosen payoff function would shape any system to see the truth. Now, one could push back and say, well, maybe you're wrong in treating all the payoff functions equally. Maybe evolutionary theory is biased towards the ones that are homomorphisms. And I say, perfectly fine if you want to go there. That is not standard evolutionary theory. Right. Standard evolutionary theory right now says that all the payoff functions are equally likely. So you would have to have a new evolutionary theory, and you'd have to justify it. So what is the new fact about reality, and what is the evidence for this new fact about reality that allows you to put a bias on the set of payoff functions such that the ones that are homomorphic, the ones that actually preserve structures of the world, are more likely? Now, no one has yet taken up that challenge, but if someone wants to take up that challenge, I'd be very interested to see what their theory was. But right now, current evolutionary theory is very, very clear. I should now immediately talk about two criticisms of the theory that have come out. First from philosophers, and then from cognitive scientists. I get the same criticism almost all the time from philosophers, and that is that I've shot myself in the foot logically. So, and the argument at top level goes like this. Darwin has a theory of evolution and natural selection in which there are real physical organisms competing for real physical resources and really dying in a physical world. Now, Hoffman is using the mathematics of evolutionary game theory to test whether there are such things as real physical organisms or real physical resources. Now, either the mathematics of evolutionary game theory faithfully models Darwin's ideas, or it doesn't. If it doesn't, Hoffman couldn't possibly use evolutionary game theory to disprove these fundamental ideas of Darwin's about, real resources and real organisms. And if it does faithfully, if mathematics of evolutionary game theory does faithfully model Darwin's ideas, it couldn't possibly contradict them. Either way, Hoffman is in what philosophers call an unfortunate dialectical situation, right? In other words, he shot himself in the foot. Poor stupid Hoffman, he shot himself in the foot. He used the mathematics of evolutionary theory to shoot evolutionary theory itself in the foot, and therefore to shoot the mathematics in the foot. And so he couldn't be dumber, couldn't be more stupid than doing that. So my reply is that this argument completely misunderstands the nature of scientific theories and the nature of scientific progress. So first, scientific theories. Scientific theories can never be a theory of everything. No scientific theory can ever be a theory of everything. Every scientific theory says, grant me, please, this handful of assumptions. Grant me these assumptions. If you grant me these assumptions, those assumptions give me a scope of problems that I can solve for you. But there are also limits. No theory is a theory of everything. So take Einstein and his theory of space-time, right? He granted a couple assumptions, you get his theory of space-time. And you grant those assumptions. If you grant them, you get all this stuff that he can explain. So there's an incredible scope to his theory. But there's also a limit. And his mathematics tells you the limits. His notion of space-time falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. The point of your mathematics. So by the way, everybody knows the story about Einstein, that he had his intuition about general relativity, about being in an elevator and standing on a scale, seeing your weight, and then all of a sudden the elevator cord gets cut and the elevator drops. All of a sudden your weight goes to zero. If you were steady, all of a sudden your weight would be zero. That was his big idea, but it took him 7 or 8 years to take that idea and turn it into the mathematics of general relativity. And he was Einstein. So this brilliant guy, it took him 7 or 8 years to turn the idea into the mathematics. But once he did it, he took his idea, he got the mathematics of general relativity. That mathematics, together with his other work on quantum theory, entails that the very idea behind the mathematics of space-time, that idea falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. So the point of the math is this. It tells you the scope and the limits of your fundamental assumptions. And that's the key point. A good scientific theory, when you write down the mathematics to capture your intuition, the mathematics does not succeed if it tells you that your theory is a theory that will never fail. No, that's not the point. The point is the mathematics has really done its job when it tells you the scope and the limits of your concepts. So that's what I'm doing with Darwin's theory. We're using evolutionary game theory to show you there's incredible scope, but there's also limits. The very concept of objects in space and time itself, the theory tells you that is one place where the theory has a problem. And that's beautiful. When the theory points and says, this is a limit of this theory, the very concept of a real physical object being the fundamental nature of reality cannot be correct. Now, what Darwin's theory and my work in evolutionary game theory with Chaitan and others, and by the way, I should mention Brian Marion and Justin Mark and my graduate students and others who work with me on this. What that mathematics does is it tells you the scope and the limits. And every scientific theory is going to have the same issue. Every scientific theory, if the mathematics is done right, will tell you the limits of that theory. But the theory will not tell you what your next move needs to be, right? So Einstein's theory tells us that space-time falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Great. Does it tell us what to do next? No. It just says this theory stops there. So we have to take a creative, and that's the fun part of science. You get now, and this is usually the older guys die with their theories, and the younger guys are the ones who jump in and get the new bold hypothesis, right? So you have to then jump beyond the limits of your old theory with new ideas, write down the mathematics, which will have its own scope and limits. But one constraint on your new theory is you better give back the old theory as a special case. So if you can't do that, then there's no reason to take you seriously. I mean, evolutionary theory is not the final word, but it is an incredibly beautiful and powerful theory. We have nothing anywhere close to it. And there's nothing close to it. So if your deeper theory does not give you back evolution with natural selection as a special case, I'm not interested in it. I just have no interest. You're not doing the right thing. And the same thing for whatever is beyond space-time. Space-time is not fundamental. Whatever theory you're going to come up with beyond space-time, be as creative as you want to. Whatever you need to do, drinking beer, taking drugs, whatever it is, to get your idea. But then eventually you have to turn it into math, and you better get back Einstein's special and general relativity and quantum field theory as special cases of this more general theory, or you're just not interesting. You're just not interesting. So that's my reply to the philosophers on this. I'm not in some unfortunate dialectical situation. This is the way science progresses. This is just the way it works. The mathematics, if it properly captures the intuitions of a theory, in the best case, it will then tell you the limits of those intuitions. They will tell you where they stop. And what I'm saying is that the mathematics of evolutionary game theory tells us that Darwin's intuitions were incredible. What a genius. But the very notion of objects in space-time itself, we have to let go. We'll have to have a deeper theory. Now, that's from the philosopher side. From the cognitive scientist side, the common argument that I get is, well, if you have not just one fitness payoff function, but a lot of fitness payoff functions, and you throw the fitness payoff functions at this organism fairly quickly, and then effectively the organism can't be tuned to any one fitness payoff function, and so the best thing is to be tuned to the truth. So an organism that's constantly facing a lot of different fitness payoffs, one after another, will eventually be tuned just to the truth. Now, what's remarkable about that to me right off the bat is, first, effectively they're saying the fitness payoffs themselves never actually shape the sensory systems, or they don't shape the fitness payoff functions themselves come and go so quickly that they don't actually affect the selection process. They're not what that actually. So this argument from the get-go fundamentally throws away the whole point of evolutionary game theory. The fitness payoff functions are there to actually talk about the selection process. But I'll just put that to the side. One group said, so we have all these fitness payoff functions, and we're going to say that there's only one mapping from the world. If there's only one mapping from the external physical world onto our perceptual representations, and you have all these changing fitness payoff functions, then you will be selected to see just the truth. That'll be the maximum payoff thing. So I disagree with the argument that there's only one mapping from the external world to sensory representations. In the case of one concrete example is that in vision we have what's called the dorsal and the ventral stream. So in vision you get if I look at like a green apple, I get one representation of the green apple in my dorsal stream, and it's a representation that lets me do one kind of task with it, which is like to recognize what it is. And I get a different one in the that's the ventral stream. In the dorsal stream, I get a different representation, more about how I can manipulate it, how I can handle it, how I might throw it or walk around it or whatever it might be. So you get the claim that there's only one representation goes out the window. We actually have multiple representations with all the different sensory systems that we have, right? The different modalities are different representations. And we also have, well, I'll just stop there, but I'll just say, when you allow that there could be multiple mappings from the objective world into your perceptual representations, then you start doing what you can call clustering analysis. Imagine that there are 20,000 fitness payoff functions that are relevant. Well, what you might do is start to cluster them and say, so you do hierarchical clustering and say, well, these payoff functions are very similar, and these are, so let's build a mental representation of this group and another mental representation of this group. And I think that's what we did, and that's what we call physical objects. What we call physical, when I see an apple versus a pencil versus a fork, what I'm doing is that's part of this hierarchical clustering. I'm taking all these different fitness payoff functions, I'm grouping them together and saying, this group I will call an apple. This group. So once again, the idea is not that we don't see the truth, but that what's going on is we see roughly 30,000 different kinds of objects, basic level categories of objects. And that's just due to the different kinds of hierarchical clustering that we do, so that we can actually, when we do the hierarchical clustering, then we can get the maximum fitness payoff we can get from that cluster, because the payoff functions are all similar in their function. So when you actually rerun the simulations that these cognitive scientists have run to try to show that we're wrong, rerun the simulations with allowing hierarchical clustering, then you find out that no, truth does not win. The payoffs, the fitness payoffs win.
At this point, I think that there are two directions in which we should go, or two things that we should touch on, and I'll just list them. The first is, I think it would be nice to bring the FBT theorem down to earth a bit by discussing maybe how it relates to one of the concrete examples we've touched on. So like the Beatles and the Stubbies or something like that. And then the other thing, so you can hop on these at will, is that I'd like to return to something that you said at the beginning of your response. So you said that the FBT theorem revolves around this simple question: what is the probability that a sensory system would be shaped by or shaped to perceive objective reality? And I think that the phrasing of this question, at least prima facie, presupposes the existence of and some sort of understanding of objective reality. And so what I'm wondering in this case is, if you want to abandon space-time and the objects we conceive of as situated in the same, then just how do you think of objective reality as it's referenced in the question? Or maybe this is a fact that isn't necessary to unpack for purposes of the FBT theorem.
Well, maybe I'll just talk about that briefly first, and then go to the other. We often get the question, how in the world could you possibly prove that we don't see reality unless you actually knew what reality was, right? Come on, Hoffman, you're shooting yourself in the foot again, right? If you don't, you have to assume that you know reality is to prove that we're not seeing it. And the point is that we don't have to. We can say, look, if reality had a total order, what's the probability that you would see it? 0. Oh, that's interesting. If reality had a topology, what's the probability that you would see it? 0. And then you start to see a pattern here, 0, 0, 0, and then you look at it and you go, oh, well, here's the pattern. When you look at all the payoff functions and you look at the ones that are going to be homomorphic, the ones that are homomorphic have to satisfy a certain equation to be homomorphic. Well, what's the probability that you're going to actually satisfy that equation? 0. There you go. I mean, that top level, that's why we just say it doesn't matter, what the structure is. But of course, we'll want to go and prove more and more structures. We'll just go down the line, prove more. Maybe eventually we can use category theory to somehow just do the whole shooting match. But the top level idea is this: whatever structure you pick, there's going to be an equation for that structure, and the set of functions that satisfy that equation is going to be measure 0. That's it. That's what equations do. They cut things way, way down. And so that's sort of the quick answer to the second part. But to bring the FBT down to brass tacks with like the jewel beetle. The jewel beetle example is an example where what did evolution do for one of the most important sensory decisions a male beetle will ever make? What are the, I mean, you need to know what is food and you need to know what is a mate. You also need to know what is a predator, right? So predators, food, and mates are like really critical things. And if you don't get it right, you're not going to pass on your genes. And you got to get the mates right. You have to know what a female is. So you would think, okay, well, if evolution is going to tell you the truth about anything, it's going to tell you the truth about what a female is or what a male is. Well, and here we see clear evidence for, the jewel beetle, literally climbing all over the bottle, full body contact with the bottle and not getting it. Simply not. And by the way, the same thing is true of, there are some birds. You give them, you would think, okay, evolution should tell them what is one of their eggs. What is my egg and what's not an egg? That's a pretty important perceptual thing. Well, it turns out for many of these birds, bigger is better. So you can take a big rock and stick it in the nest, and they will sit on that rock. Many birds will sit on that rock instead of their own eggs. They prefer it. And so here again, what's going on? What evolution does is it doesn't tune you to the truth. It gives you a trick or a hack. And in many cases, the trick or the hack comes with certain exaggerations that are preferred. So apparently, the hack for these birds with eggs is the bigger the egg, the better it is, the more attractive, the more I should pay attention to it. So these are just little heuristics, like bigger is better. And same thing apparently with the male jewel beetle with the bottle. Apparently, I don't know this for sure, so I'm just speculating. But my guess is that the size of that bottle, and maybe the intensity of the gloss, maybe it was more glossy than any females. But the point is, it was the glossier the better, the bigger the better, something like that. So these are called supernormal stimuli. So that's a term in the field, supernormal stimuli, and they're all over the place. So and the same thing is true in male ratings of female attractiveness. So makeup is supernormal. So when a woman puts on red lipstick and colors, in her eyes and so forth, and ends up looking more attractive than if she hadn't. Well, there's nothing in nature that males did not have that. Females did not naturally have those things in the past. So we did not evolve those things to see the truth. What's really going on is females are giving us supernormal stimuli for patterns that are already wired into us. So we're not even wired to know exactly what a real female looks like. We have, again, our own tricks and hacks. And apparently, our one of our tricks or hacks is, to a certain extent, the redder the lips, the better. That even if they're redder than is physiologically possible, that still works for us. So this is true all over the place. We get supernormal, and by the way, the limbal rings that you can put on, if they're supernormal, they just look more attractive up to a point. Once you go past a certain point, then you get a clown effect, right? Then you go over the edge, and it turns into. But you can push these things a long way before, and it remains supernormal and more attractive. But eventually, someone who doesn't know how to use the makeup just looks like a clown, right? They no longer look attractive. So you can't push it forever. At some point, the mechanism will say no more. But what this shows again is not. And this is, again, a point that Pinker makes in his book, How the Mind Works, and in his paper, So How Does the Mind Work? He really makes the point that evolution is going to shape us not to have necessarily true beliefs, but to have beliefs that we can compute in real time. We need to be able to compute this stuff fast. We need to be able to, sometimes our beliefs need to match social norms. We need to fit in with our group, and so forth. So there are all sorts of other pressures from an evolutionary point of view that keep. Sometimes we want to show off. Academics, might have exotic beliefs just to show off how smart they are, right? And that might explain, as Pinker says in this article, that could explain a lot of academic behavior. So there's all sorts of reasons that there are selection pressures against true beliefs And one of them, the big ones that Pinker mentions, is that simply that in many cases, we're doing inductive inference. We're making, you're forced to guess. And so you have to use the best assumptions that you can. And any assumption will have limited applicability. And so whatever assumptions you build your inference based on will have their own limits. And those limits will end up leading you to non-veridical perceptions. So that's just part and parcel of evolutionary theory, where I've taken it an extra step. So Pinker is very, very clear in his book that evolution shapes us to not have true beliefs. And he takes on Jerry Fodor. Right? So Jerry Fodor has a book called The Mind Doesn't Work That Way. So he's responding to Pinker's book, How the Mind Works. And Jerry just writes a book called The Mind Doesn't Work That Way. And Fodor basically says there's no reason to believe that their cognitive systems have not been shaped to have true beliefs, that all the selection pressures are for true beliefs. And Pinker then goes on and says, no, there's all these reasons why we would not have true beliefs. But then Steve, and of course, Steve is brilliant. He's a good friend. He's been a great colleague and friend and help to me over the years. But one place where I think we may differ, maybe not, I don't know, what I'd have to see. In his paper, he says that one place where we may have true beliefs is on our perception of the distribution of everyday middle-sized objects, tables, chairs, forks, and spoons. And I'm saying the evolutionary argument even counts against true perceptions of those things too. Those objects, everyday middle-sized objects, even the space-time in which we perceive them existing, all of that is also an evolutionary hack. It's not the truth.
Well, okay, for the moment, I think let's just totally grant the FBT theorem, so that the probability that natural selection results in our perception of the truth is null. We'll totally grant that. Then I think this brings us back to what we do perceive. And so I'm wondering how this leads to where we started with this idea of the computer desktop or the phone screen, the home phone screen, and then what we haven't mentioned yet, at least not explicitly, which is the interface theory of perception, or the ITP.
Right. So from an evolutionary point of view, if we haven't been shaped to see the truth, then what have we been shaped to see? Well, we've been shaped to see something that guides adaptive behavior. That's what that's when if you just stick with what evolution, you've been shaped with sensory perceptions that guide adaptive behavior. Period. Well, how can we understand those? Well, what metaphor could we use to understand them? And that's where I use the desktop, metaphor or virtual reality headset metaphor. If you're playing a game of Grand Theft Auto, for example, a VR version with people around the world, and I look over to the right and I see a red Ferrari. There's no real red Ferrari anywhere. I render the red Ferrari and I perceive it when I look there. As soon as I look away, it's garbage collected. It's gone. And in the supercomputer that's running the Grand Theft Auto game, if you looked inside, you would find no red Ferraris inside that supercomputer anywhere. There's just diodes and resistors and voltages. So the red Ferrari and all the cars that I see, including the steering wheel of my ride, the dashboard, the gas pedal, all the stuff that I'm seeing gets rendered on the fly. It's there when I look. Yeah, there's a steering wheel and I see the avatar hands on the steering wheel when I look. As soon as I look away, there are no hands and no steering wheel anywhere. If you look inside the supercomputer, there's no hands in the supercomputer, there's no steering wheel. So when does that hand and that steering wheel exist, and where? It exists only when I look, and it only exists in my perception, period. Nowhere else. It's rendered on the fly and it's deleted on the fly. So we're rendering and deleting on the fly. And that's what I'm saying the physical world is. I look at the moon, I render the moon. I look at the car, I render the car. I look at my fork, I render the fork. As soon as I look away, that rendering, there is some reality. In the VR game, there is some reality in that metaphor. It's the supercomputer that I'm saying is the reality, just for sake of the image, of the argument. But I'm saying that space-time itself is just our VR headset. And we render all the physical objects we see, we render on the fly. And you go, well, but my friend Joe, I mean, if I'm not looking at the tennis ball, friend Joe sees the tennis ball, so surely that means the tennis ball is there. No, imagine a virtual reality game of tennis. So I take a virtual tennis ball and I hit it, and I hit the tennis ball, and my friend hits it back. Well, actually, my tennis ball is the one I see in my headset, and Joe's is the one that he sees in his headset. And if I say, oh, but there really is a tennis ball. There's not just my headset. Look, I can take a tennis ball. I'm not looking at it. I can drop it. Joe, do you still see it? And he goes, oh yeah, I still see it. Well, he's rendering a tennis ball in his headset. That's why he says he still sees it. So that's all that's going on. As soon as you take this VR metaphor, all the arguments that people give to saying for why I know that the reality exists even when you're not looking, just put them in VR and you'll realize that they all fall apart. You can do them all in VR and the same arguments go through. And so just think VR and you'll get the right answer on this. And that's why, by the way, I think that what I'm saying right now seems way out there. Frankly, I think within a generation it's going to look pretty. People argued about it. People didn't get this. I think that the next generation that spends half their life in virtual reality, it's going to be a no-brainer that when I take the headset off, to think about what I'm seeing now is just another headset. It's going to be a no-brainer to them. So frankly, I think it's just going to be so what, ho hum. Yeah, of course it's just a VR headset to the next generation, but to my generation, it's not. We weren't raised in VR, and we have the belief that we're seeing reality as it is.
Mm-hmm. There are some absolutely terrific images and diagrams in the book that represent this rendering idea. I have, of course, the Necker cubes in mind here. And of course, I also highly, highly recommend or encourage our listeners to read The Case Against Reality to get the full picture. But speaking of pictures, you've already mentioned supernormal stimuli, which I hadn't heard of before reading the book and are tremendously fascinating in their own right. But I found it very funny to see that artifacts in our perceptual system that promote our perception of fitness payoffs over reality can be hijacked and manipulated for marketing purposes. And I'm wondering if you have any favorite examples of this, because this isn't marketing in the same way, but one of my favorite pictures in the book is of a woman who's wearing a pair of jeans, each side of which has been stitched differently. And consequently, and really quite dramatically, one half of her butt is a lot more attractive than the other, even though they're the same pants, just stitched slightly differently.
That's right. For many years, I consulted for jeans companies, and also for marketing more generally. Once you know this stuff, we actually have a patent, by the way, for the jeans stuff. So I have a patent through UCI. So the idea is that I'll just do the jeans to be concrete. When you put on a pair of jeans, if it's a tight-fitting pair of jeans, you're going to project a shape for your body. People will see a shape. And the stitching, and also, if you have shading, you have wear and tear. So if you have a wear, you might have dark blue over here and then the lighter blue here because of the wear. So those wear patterns and the stitching patterns are going to automatically be interpreted by the visual system in terms of a 3D shape. That's compulsory. That's not optional. When people look at you in your jeans, the stitching and the wear patterns convey a 3D shape that's automatically perceived by the visual system. You can't stop it. The only question is it conveying the 3D shape that you want to convey or not? Now, most jean manufacturers, they're using wear and tear just to show the jean is distressed, for example, and they're putting their logos and stitching just for whatever reason. They want their logo here and they want the stitching there. But when you actually look at it, the way you put the various kinds of stitching, the logos and the wear patterns is giving a 3D impression, which is attributed then to the shape of the person's body who's wearing the jeans. So I showed these companies years. This is over. I worked with them for many years. I remember going to the executive group of one of the largest, maybe the largest clothing consortium in the United States, and the CEO was there. And I put a picture of their jeans up there, and I showed them what their wear pattern was. And then I just said, if I change it, and I just changed the shading a little bit to make the rear end to look a little bit more shapely. No one wants pancake butt. So, there's nobody who wants pancake butt. And no one wants to, perhaps whatever I won't tell you what you want. You can want whatever you want, but I can, whatever you want, I can make that happen, right? If you want pancake butt, I can give you pancake butt. If you want big butt, you can have whatever you want. So the question, but you can ask, what do most consumers want? Most consumers don't want pancake butt. I'll put it that way. I'm not going to tell you what everybody has to want, but if you're looking to sell jeans that are going to be bought by a lot of people, you need to give people what they want. And most people are going to want something that's nicely curved, but not maybe too big or not too small. But there are exceptions, and you can have niche markets. So that's perfectly fine. We can do whatever you want. The technology is perfectly versatile. You can give people anything you want. But the fact is that the jeans companies didn't know that you could do this, that you could change the shading gradients and change what people look like. So in the picture in my book, I actually have jeans where this one woman inside the pair of jeans, on the one side, she looks completely flat. On the other side, she looks very nice and curved. And that's what, I'm not saying everybody has to like that, but that's what it's going to sell most of the time. And so I'm not putting any value judgments on this at all, but the jeans companies put a dollar judgment. They paid me, and they hired, and several of my graduate students are now full-time in this world, right? So they've started their own companies. They're doing this kind of stuff, and they're doing well, and it works. But if you make subtle changes in the placement of the logos, the stitching, and the shading, and all of a sudden, bang, for most people, you can go, wow, that looks a lot more attractive. So we can do that. Yeah, I also help them with their advertising more generally. One little trick, for example, that I use is that we have an attentional system, right? And you have to understand how human attention works. The whole point in advertising and marketing is, in some sense, to grab attention to your product and away from the competition. If you want to do that intelligently, you need to understand the rudiments of human attention. Well, there's lots of things to say, but one thing I mentioned in my book is that we have a special attentional system devoted that's attracted by animals, by animate objects, right? And that makes sense. If things can move, they could either be predator or prey. In either case, they're important. If they're predator, we really need to know very, very quickly. So things that seem to have autonomous movement, we're on it, and and that grabs our attention. Things with eyes. If there's an eye out there, you better look. You better pay. So we are hypersensitive to eyes, and that's why when you look up in clouds, what do you don't see grass. You see faces. You see eyes. Your visual system is really looking for the things that could make a difference to you. Faces, eyes, animate objects. So one thing that I helped these companies do was we could make eyes that are very abstract eyes, but still meet the visual system's definition of an eye. But you don't obviously know when you look at it that it's an eye. And I could just put it where I want to in my advertisement, or as maybe the backdrop to the whole advertisement. You just know that you somehow you're riveted to looking at this advertisement and not the others. You don't know why, but what I've done is I've tapped into your animate monitoring system and made sure that you pay attention to my product and not the others. But what we had to do was to do it in a way where the competition didn't know what we were doing. So we had to make it abstract. If we just threw an eye on there, they go, oh, well, that's an eye, so we'll just throw an eye on our. So what I had to do was to go more abstract. What is the minimal stimulus that the visual system will need to get riveted to say, oh, there's probably an eye over there? My competition won't figure that out. If I do it, abstract enough, they won't figure out what we're doing. And so that's the kind of thing and that's why we got paid the big bucks, was to really take the high-level cognitive science and visual perception and this evolutionary stuff and help them make money. The fact that you don't see the truth can make you huge money. When you understand it and you know how to exploit it, the companies pay me quite a bit to do that.
This might not have been the normative or prescriptive dimension to our conversation that you were expecting or how we would finish, but there are a few things few things more important to people than being attractive. And the sort of knowledge you have about perception can be used to dress or present oneself as more attractive. And I'm wondering if there are any resources that you know of that have taken advantage of this body of information, like books or blogs, or your former students might have podcasts or anything like this.
Well, my book has quite a bit on it. So, and a lot of the science, if you want to understand the science behind this and then practical applications, my book is probably the best place to start. I wrote a secret book for a company, a major company that I won't say what the company was, but you would know their name, and they have billions every year in marketing. And so I wrote them a secret book years ago, but I can't publish that book, but I was able to take the basic concepts that I gave them, and those concepts are in my book. So I of course I didn't plagiarize but I took the high level concepts, repackaged them in my book. So you can now, there were things I told the company I didn't say in my book, so I didn't give it all away, but you get a big picture from my book about the big ideas and there are books on evolution and there's a book on supernormal stimuli. So I think there's a book called Supernormal Stimuli. So you can that would be a good book. But again, I'm not sure how much. No, that would be a good place to go. That book. I also think if there are other. I'm waiting for a book that, and I'm not going to write it because I've got other things on my list. But that could be a very lucrative book.
It could.
Oh, absolutely. But I think the first 3 or 4 chapters of my book have probably the best and most accessible introduction most people are going to get.
Okay, great. Well, Don, this has been awesome on so many fronts. I'm anxious to see what you're working on next. So thanks so much for doing this with me.
Thank you very much, Robinson.
Hold on. If you haven't subscribed, liked, commented, or reviewed, that would be so helpful. And if you haven't yet, you could also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Robinson Earhart.